From the president's stockpile of personal protective excuses in Mitch McConnell's backyard, you're listening to Democratica, the political podcast for anyone who wants to understand the news without risking all our lives for a f***ing haircut. You're AJ Johnson.
And you are Stuart Max.
I'm a 13-year Capitol Hill veteran, a political insider, and the founder of the OD Action newsletter and Political Action Network.
And I'm a one-time television, radio, and media news recluse. That is PC pre-corona.
Yeah, PC pre-corona. And now that we are living in corona or IC,
then you have no choice. There's nothing to do but watch the news and freak out about your life.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is there are things that we can do about the crazy world that we are living in, because I've said it before, I'll say it again. Nature created the virus, but Trump made it a crisis. We went from our government leaders, we'll just say it, Republicans in the federal government, downplaying this pandemic, this virus in the early days, and even into middle March, people like Donald Trump saying it was no big deal. The governor of Oklahoma tweeting a picture of himself in a crowded restaurant, even as in Kentucky, we were closing down our restaurants. In many states that have taken it seriously, cases, deaths, and hospitalizations, new ones, seem to be on the decline, which is a really good thing. And so what we're seeing is the things that we are doing are working. We need to be doing all the things that the medical professionals are telling us we need to do to stop the onslaught of this disease. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't seeing it that way. We saw protests in the past week, people clustering together in the streets, protesting stay-at-home orders all over the country. This is happening, and it's really tempting to call these people idiots.
That is a nicer word than I had.
Well, it's because they're idiots.
There you go.
I'm going to play our governor's response to this as he was giving his daily press conference and heard the sounds of protesters outside protesting these shelter-in-place guidelines.
I don't know. There's some noise in the background. We do have some folks up here in Kentucky today, and everybody should be able to express their opinion that believes we should reopen Kentucky immediately right now. Folks, that would kill people. It would absolutely kill people.
What these people or these protesters are actually doing while they're claiming to stand up for their own and everyone else's individual liberties, they're actually killing people as they speak. And they're saying that they have the right to kill people. They have the right to kill each other as well as anyone else who comes in contact with them.
Yeah, and let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. These are, by and large, white Republicans who have draped themselves in the flag of patriotism for decades. The same people who rallied around George Bush almost 20 years ago and supported the Patriot Act. A lot of the Patriot Act was bipartisan at the time, let's be very clear, but we're very willing to give away their civil liberties in order to combat a seen enemy, so long as it was a foreign brown enemy. And now that we have this invisible enemy, they are taking to the streets in a way that endangers themselves, their loved ones, and their entire communities. And to put this in perspective, can you imagine these protests of people who are defying public safety, defying orders from their governors, defying guidance from the federal government to protest in a way that is endangering their own lives and the lives of their communities? Can you imagine that happening if they were not almost exclusively white, if these were black people protesting in the streets? Before social distancing, in olden days, we were seeing multiple stories a week of black men being killed for carrying an iced tea with a hoodie up, reaching for their driver's license, holding their hands in the air.
Basic threatening things.
Now here we have white people who are actually endangering lives, and terrifyingly, this is having an effect. 4 states in the last few days alone have announced that they are loosening restrictions, not because the medical professionals are telling them that this is okay, not because they've seen a significant decline in the infected or in the death rates, because they are caving to the pressure from these Republican protesters. And to be fair-ish to the Republicans, this is a minority of Republicans. In poll after poll, we're seeing that large majorities of the public are more afraid of opening too quickly.
2/3.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And majorities of Republicans as well. And yet, these protesters are having a profound enough effect that governors of South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas have all announced that they are starting to reopen their economies. Now, they are still saying they recommend sheltering in place. In South Dakota, one of the 4 states that never issued shelter-in-place guidelines, Governor Kristi Noem, who was seen as a rising star in the Republican Party, hopefully, if any good comes of this, it will be that she is no longer seen as a rising anything. They now have the hottest hotspot for coronavirus in the country that endangers our entire food supply chain, because at Smithfield Food in South Dakota, which employs 3,400 people, at least 20% of their workforce is now infected.
Jesus.
And yeah, you know, if she was taking her cues from the president, and if the president had taken this more seriously, if he had put out a message that he was prioritizing life over re-election, life over saving face, Kristi Noem probably would have done the right thing by the people that she is ostensibly supposed to be serving. Also, I want to call attention to the historical precedent to this. Tim Mack, who's an investigative correspondent for NPR, apparently got way into the weeds this weekend, digging into the 1918 and 1919 flu pandemic and the anti-mask league that cropped up in San Francisco. You can read about it on his Twitter feed at Tim K. Mack, M-A-K. Basically, into 1918, the 1918 flu had been really devastating. But into the fall, people were wearing masks, and they had really slowed the spread of the virus. 80% of people were wearing masks. Again, that umbrella metaphor of when an umbrella is keeping you dry in a rainstorm, do you say, hey, I'm dry, I don't need this umbrella anymore? Or do you say, hey, this umbrella is keeping me dry?
Clearly, you say, let's toss it away.
That credit where credit is due, that umbrella analogy is an RBG original, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissenting argument on dismantling the Voter Rights Act, disputing the idea that the Voting Rights Act had fixed everything and therefore we don't need it. She said that's like throwing away an umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because it's kept you dry. All hail RBG, please. Right? Stay safe, stay healthy. We love you. So anyway, so in San Francisco, much as today, there was a rebellion to the idea of wearing masks, to the science-based approach to preventing a spread of the pandemic. This was happening in December. By January, the 1918 flu had, this was now in 1919, had come back with a vengeance. And in San Francisco, where this movement, this anti-mask league had begun to influence politicians, even though it was just for a short time, but politicians were saying, okay, we don't need masks anymore. And they started to roll back these mandatory guidelines only for a short time because eventually it became clear that's what was needed. 0.2% of the population of San Francisco died. That's pretty horrifying. So this is a way that even just a small group of people can have tremendous impact for the negative. And of course, Trump himself has tweeted that we need to liberate the states that have Democratic governors who are enforcing the very guidelines that his administration is putting out, in all caps. Liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia. When asked about the fact the people who were listening to the things that he was saying were defying his own administration's recommendation, endangering themselves, endangering their loved ones, endangering their communities, and, for what it's worth, delaying the reopening that they were calling for, he said they seem very responsible. He stood by them. Here we have Trump, who is surrounded by brilliant medical experts, acknowledging that they are the best in their field, and then actively encouraging people, his own supporters, to do the opposite. He's a Pied Piper for the 21st century, and his followers are all too happy to follow him off the cliff.
Could that be part of the strategy? If these are states that he supposedly doesn't care about, isn't he also helping to suppress the actual number of deaths?
It's a really good question. And if you recall, when coronavirus was becoming a problem, there was a cruise ship that was infected and people were isolated on the cruise ship, and Trump didn't want them let off into the country, even though they would have been immediately quarantined. It was not a danger. It was not going to spread. But he didn't want them let off because he didn't want them on American shores to add to our numbers. He said, quote, I like our numbers where they are. And so the president, from the very early days of this, has explicitly said he is interested in making himself look good. And it's that simple. And in New York, in California, he has made very clear that he could not care less about saving lives in those states. He won Michigan by less than 1%. And yet he is actively encouraging Republicans to go do things that are going to get them killed. Is there a calculus that he's stoking flames that will turn people against their Democratic governors?
I mean, don't you see that happening? Don't you see the next protest, any protest that a Democratic governor decides this has to be shut down, leading to some sort of uprising, some sort of excuse for vigilante militia action? I mean, it just seems like in this day and age, that is sadly not an unrealistic scenario or an unrealistic strategy that Trump might have, or the Republicans might have concocted.
He has driven a wedge on an issue where he finds himself on the unpopular side, on the very unpopular side, on a side that, as you said, 2-1 in the American public are not with him on this. Even a majority of Republicans are not with him on this. You know, it's possible that he's playing chess and he's seeing 10 moves ahead, where right now we're looking and saying,
No. Let's not. I don't even want to start on this metaphor. He's not playing anything.
I think it was George Conway who said, some people say he's playing checkers while the rest of the world is playing chess. No, I think the rest of the world is playing chess and he's eating the pieces. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is not a wise place for him to be drawing the line politically, even if you set aside the fact that he's sacrificing his own supporters, and not only through encouraging them to ignore social distancing, but to encourage these miracle cures, these magic cures that he has touted. People are dying from those as well. Donald Trump says it might work, so I'm going to give that a shot. Only his hardcore supporters are doing that, and some of them have already died. So it is hard to see how this is a well thought out strategy and anything more than just him being really vindictive and acting out against Democrats who he doesn't like. So 2 governors who have kind of gone out of their way to do the job that the president isn't doing. As much as the president has said that it's not his job to provide things to the states, which it is. He's the president. What's that thing he's the president of? The United Trumps? Oh yeah, the United States. So two amazing examples. And I just think that I've said this so many times, I'm going to keep saying it. The context of this happening while the president is quibbling over what is and isn't his job. Okay, so Larry Hogan, Republican governor of Maryland, secured 500,000 tests. The tests which are the key to reopening our societies, because without tests, we can't truly know, have we flattened the curve? Have people started to get sick at a slower rate? Are things actually getting better versus worse? So the governor of Maryland, after the president failed to deliver the tests that he swore he had, remember this, anybody who wants a test can get a test. So the governor of Maryland's wife, Suni Hogan, she grew up in South Korea. She became a citizen in the early 90s of the United States, speaks fluent Korean, of course. So she reached out through her channels, not only identified 500,000 tests, negotiated the deal herself, and had those tests delivered to the people of Maryland. So now Maryland, they had to do a deal halfway around the world so that they could have what they need to get their societies on track when they're ready. That is obscene that they were put in that position, and it's really incredible they figured out a way to get that done. In Illinois, Democratic Governor Pritzker, who is a wealthy man in his own right, not unlike, by the way, the President of the United States, personally funded 2 flights to China so that they could get protective gear for their medical professionals because the president wasn't getting the job done. These are all things that the President of the United States can do, should be doing, would be doing if the sanctity of life meant a thing to him. And these people call themselves pro-life. New rule, that's not allowed. Supporters of Donald Trump can no longer call themselves pro-life. What a joke. So before we get to today's call to action, AJ put out a call last week for people to email me and share their stories. And so we did have one that I wanted to highlight. Michelle from Missouri wrote in. She's COVID positive. She has an immunocompromised heart and vascular issues. She's working really closely with doctors who have so far kept her home and out of the hospital. She's lonely. It's really hard. And yet she wasn't writing in about herself. She's writing in about her son who is serving a sentence in a prison where there is COVID-19. And he is also immunocompromised. She wanted us to bring bring attention to the really horrible conditions in prisons right now. It is a petri dish for disease, but there are things that we can do. It starts with acknowledging prisoners are human beings. Many of them are in there for nonviolent crimes, some for entirely victimless crimes. Frequently, they are in there due to a system where the deck is stacked heavily against people of color, against people who are poor, and currently would not be a threat to people if they were outside of those walls. But inside of those walls, they are certainly threatened. And so your call to action today is to contact your state's governor. You can find your governor's contact information by going to odaction.com/governor. odaction.com/governor. Find your governor's contact information. Let them know prisoners are human beings. We need to remove them from a situation that is jeopardizing their lives. Again, we are talking about nonviolent people who are not a threat to our society in already overcrowded systems. So go to odaction.com/governor, find out how to contact your governor and tell them prisoners are people too, and we need to act now to save their lives. Moment of uplift. Moment of uplift. As with most of my moments of uplift, it is a bit of a mixed bag. It shouldn't have had to happen. But in Colorado, where some of these protests against social distancing were happening near hospitals, healthcare professionals from a nearby hospital showed up in sidewalks, standing in front of cars, arms folded, not saying a word in front of these angry protesters who were risking lives. And really, you know, they acknowledged that this was about the symbolism of reminding people that there was a flip side to the story. These angry people who were refusing to stay in their home despite medical professionals telling them leaving would endanger lives. These people who are doing the work of saving those lives, who are every day face to face with people who are suffering, who are dying, that they would then put their bodies on the line and stand in front of these angry protesters to say, no, we're not letting you in unchallenged. We could be using this time to go home and sleep. Certainly they need it. And instead, they took this courageous act, and we've got some incredibly powerful images that we'll put on the website, odaction.com/democratica. Not all superheroes wear capes, but it sure seems like everybody who wears scrubs is a superhero these days.
It's not as if they have nothing else to do. These are people that are giving up their time, giving up their possibly risking their health, and then on top of that and working what are obviously very needed shifts. They go out and they also manage to do some good once again for not just themselves, but for the rest of us. That too, to me, seems like a double mitzvah. At this point, that is the very least that we can ask for, and it seems that we're becoming more and more able to give it to each other, or at least I choose to keep believing that.
We're really seeing how many truly good people there are, and good people in this crisis seem to be driven to do remarkable things, and it's great to watch.
It's just great to know that people are still doing good, feeling good, and being good to one another. So please share any and all moments of uplift, any and all beautiful stories, and we'll make sure that we can share as many as we can on the air with you.
That's right. You can hit me up at stuart@odaction.com. AJ? All right, buddy. Keep fighting the good fight, AJ.
You too, Stuart.
Democratica is produced by Sam Graber and engineered by Mark Charles, with support from Fifi Sun, recorded at the Ramshackler Room with music from Mike Michael. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Democratica on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, whatever podcast app you like to use. You don't want to miss an episode, and we'd miss you if you did. So please subscribe, and while you're there, leave us a 5-star review.